So we're now going to go to Australia to hear from Anna Kerr. Anna Kerr is the Australian country contact for Women's Human Rights Campaign, founder and principal solicitor of Feminist Legal Clinic, Inc., which is a community legal organisation based in Sydney. It works to advance the human rights of women and girls, and with a focus on domestic violence and discrimination laws. Anna's going to talk to us about UN, well, the title of her talk is UN bodies are being extensively manipulated by moneyed interests. Thank you so much for being here, Anna, and over to you.
Our legal service in Sydney is focused on human rights of women and girls, including domestic violence and discrimination cases. I just want to talk now a little bit about what I've learned about the United Nations. So historically, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was originally drafted to open with the words, "All men are brothers," and referred throughout to the rights of man. It was actually the intervention of an Australian, Jessie Street, the only woman delegate for Australia to the United Nations, who suggested that it should be amended, and her suggestions resulted in the declaration instead reading what it says today, which is all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Though despite Jessie Street's efforts to rid the declaration of its sexist language, she was only partially successful, and the declaration still now refers to the conscience of mankind, contradiction, isn't it? The spirit of brotherhood, and uses male pronouns throughout. So the failure to acknowledge women throughout the document undermines the very purpose of the declaration. So this is what happens when you entrust men to draft human rights. Of course, there was the notable exception of Eleanor Roosevelt, but the rest of the members of the commission that were tasked with framing the International Bill of Rights, Bill of Human Rights, which consisted of the Declaration as well as the main conventions, the rest of them were all male. So I think this photo of the commission is reminiscent of this meme, which perhaps many of you have seen before, of the dogs sitting around a table working on drafting the cat health laws. I think you all know that there's good reason why dogs shouldn't be entrusted with this responsibility. And I say that without casting aspersions on the character of any individual dog. I know that many dogs are able to control their primeval urges to chase and even eat cats. I acknowledge that not all dogs chase cats, and indeed that some dogs receive rather rough treatment from cats, including my own. Nevertheless, the fact remains that dogs pose a threat to the domestic cat, and cats, mean as they may be, do not pose an equivalent threat to dogs. Now, I think we all know that this kind of disclaimer shouldn't really be necessary, but I hope the analogy is clear. So as a result of men drafting human rights, there's a few things that they've overlooked. And I think Jessie Street attempted to establish a right for women to be free from male violence, but she was unsuccessful in having that included. And she also argued for greater recognition of the rights of motherhood. And this was also largely unsuccessful. There was a rather paternalistic compromise with the drafting of Article 25 of the Declaration of Human Rights, which groups mothers with children as needing special care and assistance. Now, this is a far cry from recognising the critical attachment between mothers and their children and the right of mothers and children not to be separated. Instead, international human rights law enshrines the family as the fundamental unit of society, despite the fact that they can't really define what the family actually is. Article 25 and other pro-family provisions were primarily the outcome of religious influence, intervention by the church, rather than lobbying by feminists. Unfortunately, deficiencies that Jessie Street was unable to have corrected in 1948 continue to impede the advancement of women's human rights today. The United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination, which we know as CEDAW, which was introduced in 1981, also fails to incorporate a right for women to be free from male violence. And it also provides inadequate recognition of maternal rights generally. It provides only that women should have equal rights with men in relation to the number and spacing of children, and only equal rights to guardianship in respect to those children. So there's a complete failure to acknowledge the greater physical, psychological, and economic investment and impact that childbearing has on women, and to ensure that this reality translates into additional human rights attaching to motherhood. It also fails to recognise the essential protective role played by mothers and the inherent risk in assuming that men are equally qualified to perform this role. So, on the basis of these international human rights provisions, legislation such as the Australian Family Law Act, for instance, is framed to protect marriage, the family, and the best interests of the child. But they fail to acknowledge any specific human right of mothers not to be separated from their children, and vice versa, children not to be separated from their mothers. And this has left the way open for child removal policies and the promotion of adoption and surrogacy arrangements, and for the abuse and manipulation of the family law system by male perpetrators. It has established a worldview in which having a relationship with one's biological mother is regarded as an optional extra, superfluous to a child's needs, and can be overridden by contractual obligations in the context of surrogacy arrangements or even immigration laws. The family law also steadfastly ignores the reality that men are overwhelmingly responsible for domestic and sexual violence occurring within families and generally, and therefore are not equally suitable to care for children. Thanks to campaigning efforts by groups like the Australian Brotherhood of Fathers, pictured here, who have set up a political party called the Australian Better Families, also ABF, we now have a situation where mothers who allege that their children are being sexually abused by their fathers are routinely disbelieved by the family court. We've just had recent research which showed only 14% of the time were women believed, and that the children in that situation are likely to, in fact, be removed from them altogether because they will be accused of parental alienation, and that is often then used as a basis for removing the children from their care and handing them over to the perpetrator, the alleged perpetrator. So this is despite copious evidence that there is in fact an epidemic of child sexual abuse taking place, and that a child's biological father is the most likely offender, 58% of the time. I was just looking at a study today. And you'll see a statistic here on the screen, which shows that in fact in 2018, the rate of police recorded sexual assaults against children was nearly twice that of against people aged 15 and over. So it's quite clear that not everyone is equally fit to mother. And here is the crux of the issue. Men and women are not equally fit to mother children. The failure to recognise real physical differences is not resulting in greater equality. It is resulting in trauma and suffering for many women and children. Indeed, sex-based differences need to be considered to avoid imposing conditions that are harmful and traumatic. It is a reality that only women menstruate, gestate, and lactate. Only women give birth. Upon being born, the baby searches only for its mother, not its father. And much as I agree that we must resist imposing sexist stereotypes on both men and women, and imposing on women, for instance, the entire domestic burden of child rearing, and we don't want to go down that path, but if we really want to prioritise the best interests of children, we have to acknowledge the realities that there are some things that mothers can do that men can't. And also that significant differences do exist between men and women in relation to violent and sexual offending behaviour. Unfortunately, at the current time, we are seeing significant moves both within our domestic laws, but also by United Nations bodies, to give greater credence to socially constructed gender identities, and in this way to dismantle women's sex-based rights and the few protections that do exist for mothers and children dealing with domestic and sexual violence. So back to the United Nations, when I had the opportunity to go to CEDAW, to go to Geneva for Australia's report to CEDAW in 2018, I was surprised to learn that out of all the many NGO delegates that were attending from the various countries that were reporting, that there was always one from each country that was being funded by the International Lesbian and Gay Association, known as ILGA. For some countries, this ILGA-funded delegate was the only individual representing civil society on behalf of women, and consequently they had a full 10 minutes to address the committee, thereby having a disproportionate influence on the committee's considerations. These delegates were funded to advance the priorities of ILGA, but were not obliged to disclose this when addressing the CEDAW committee. ILGA's agenda includes the legal recognition of sex upon self-declaration and the decriminalisation of prostitution. This agenda is incompatible with the human rights of women, but my opposition was a lone voice, and I was severely marginalised as a result of raising my concerns when I returned to Australia. But the other question is, who is funding the human rights system? And I had a bit of a look today at the annual report for United Nations Human Rights, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So this was from their 2020 annual report, and it shows that the United States government is the second biggest funder, despite being a country that has only ratified 5 of the 18 agreements passed by the United Nations. It has not ratified CEDAW or the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and yet they are controlling things because they are providing so much funding. Organisations like Microsoft and Open Society Foundation also provide significant funding to support the United Nations human rights work. And in this way, the United States and its billionaires have significant influence over the shape of international human rights law. For example, Open Society Foundation works to advance the decriminalisation of prostitution, despite this being in direct conflict with Article 6 of CEDAW, and surely provides scope for a great deal of exploitation and endangerment of women and children.
I'm going to have to get you to stop within 1 minute, just because of the time constraints.
Yeah, sure. So look, I think the thing is, with women controlling only estimated 1% of global wealth, there's a very real risk that our human rights agenda will continue to be dictated by men. The churches, the trans lobby, men's rights activists all have vastly better funded movements than gender critical feminists, and they're effectively working to dismantle the gains of the women's liberation movement. So women need to really work out how we're going to get out of this. And I think a way forward is that women are going to need to be a little bit fierce if we want to protect ourselves and our children. We really do need separate spaces. We need those safe spaces, whether it's bathrooms or hospital wards or prisons. We really do need domestic violence refuges, safe rooms in courthouses, women's health services, political quotas, scholarships. We also need to prevent stalking, harassment, male violence. We need effective law enforcement and all of these things that stop this kind of violent offending from taking place. Unfortunately, all of this is being undermined if we allow males to say they are women to gain access to women's safe spaces, services and opportunities. We need to stop encouraging men by telling them they are stunning and brave when they push the boundaries. We must stop them. We must stop letting them feed on pornography, but instead shame them for hurting and exploiting the vulnerable, and when necessary, impose effective criminal sanctions.